Hello everyone, how are you doing? My name's TryPokeMac, and I'm doing pretty good myself. As my final stop in the Game Boy Color era of Pokemon, I'm gonna play through Pokemon Crystal with only Water-type Pokemon. There are a total of 23 fully evolved Water-type Pokemon in Crystal. However, 7 of those are mono Water types, which means I have 9 options for secondary types because multiple Pokemon have Psychic, Ice, Flying, or Poison as their secondary type. As always, my team nicknames are going to follow the same theme, and my rival's name in this game is going to be the same theme as the past 2 rivals. If you can guess either, leave a comment down below. If you're correct, I'll heart your comment. If you have any ideas for future nickname themes, future rival names, or future challenges, leave your idea down below. If I use your idea, I will credit you in the video. Speaking of shoutouts, to prove that I am a disembodied voice of my word, I have 2 today. Let's start by shouting out Alex Crossley, who suggested a water-only run, and then the real gamer there for their nickname theme idea that sparked what I used this time. So if you see their comments on this video or any of my past videos, go give them a like. But fair warning, I did put a spin on the nickname theme idea, so you can't just copy-paste what they said. Without further ado, let's get this potential train wreck of a run going by immediately grabbing Neptune the Totodile. Then I followed that up by beating my rival's Chikorita and naming him Commodus. Since at this point I had no other options for catches, and it's not until the remakes that I have to take on the Sprout Tower before Falkner, we're just gonna skip straight to Falkner. This was far from the hardest fight, but it was also the one I clutched the hardest. Not wanting to be too overleveled for Falkner, I just went in at level 10, which was where Neptune naturally ended up. Which meant Neptune had no water moves, so I just used Scratch over and over until I won with a very clutch critical hit. I probably could have played better if I knew what Rage did, or used Leer at any point, but I also wouldn't have this fight any other way. So, having barely made it past Falkner, I grabbed the Fishing Rod on Route 32. Then, between Route 32 and Violet City, I caught 4 team members. Enceladus, the Tentacool, Ganymede, the Poliwag, Jupiter, the Wooper, and Callisto, the Slowpoke. I could have also grabbed a Magikarp and evolved it into Gyarados, but I chose not to for a few reasons. Gyarados doesn't learn any flying moves, and all water moves are special, so it has no stab that takes advantage of its physical nature. It won't evolve until level 20, so I wouldn't be able to use it until Whitney anyway. You get a free shiny Gyarados later, who I didn't even use, and it doesn't have access to Intimidate or a wide variety of physical moves. With that out of the way, I fought Bugsy. At level 16, although Neptune had yet to evolve, he did have water moves, so Metapod and Kakuna couldn't boost their defense to wall him. And even when it attacked, Metapod couldn't do much damage, so he fell rather quickly. And then Kakuna got very unlucky because the first water gun that hit it was a critical hit, knocking it to red health, so in 2 hits, it fell, causing Bugsy to bring out Scyther, who did not fall as easily. I have a hard time justifying in my mind now why I chose to use Leer on Neptune until he was knocked out. I knew that he was poisoned, so I probably wanted to give all my other Pokemon the best chance they had of beating Scyther. So when Neptune inevitably fell, I swapped to Enceladus and tried to poison it, which succeeded, but then I tried to use Confusion, which did not end up doing anything because Supersonic sucks, so Enceladus was eventually knocked out by Fury Cutter, but at that point Scyther was at about half health. But Fury Cutter was strong enough at that point that Ganymede and Callisto were both one-shot, bringing it to a 1v1. Luckily, by the time Jupiter came out, Scyther missed its fully powered Fury Cutter, so Jupiter survived and finished the Giant Mantis off with Slam. And luckily, the battles after this one were not nearly as clutch as the first 2. To start them off with Bugsy in the rear view, let's take on Commodus in Azalea. There are a lot of ways to summarize or describe the rival battles I've had in Johto. Lucky is typically not one of them. Except this time, because Ghastly missed Hypnosis, and for the first time in forever, Lick didn't paralyze. So, 2 Mudshots knocked it out, but then Bayleaf came out and I needed a clean switch, so I let Jupiter fall. However, that didn't stop my luck, because on my first Poison Sting with Enceladus, Bayleaf was poisoned. And sure, Razorleaf may take a quarter of Enceladus' health on the first turn and then crit the second, but he survives with 1 HP on the last one, getting off just a little more damage before he gets knocked out. But his sacrifice paved the way for me to easily beat the rest of this battle, because my starter, Neptune, not only outsped Bayleaf, but it chose to go for Growl over Razorleaf, meaning he knocked it out. I mean, I'm not sure if I could have won had he not gone for Growl, but either way, I still beat his starter, so he's down to just Zubat. Not only did I avoid getting paralyzed by Lick, I also avoided Supersonic, so no confusion. And after missing the first Supersonic, Zubat chose to only use Bite, so with 3 Water Guns, Neptune was able to put it down. I may have my problems with this team, but this is by far the smoothest this battle has gone. Before I battled Whitney, Neptune and Jupiter both evolved. The Whitney battle was meant to be the last battle for Callisto and Neptune, so I led Neptune against Clefairy, and luckily for me, Clefairy didn't get any good metronome moves, so although it took 4 turns to put down, the best thing it did was slow Neptune down. I would argue that the change in speed didn't really change what would have happened with Miltank other than making Neptune susceptible to Stomp, something that Miltank only used once against Neptune, and then after failing to flinch, never again. Against Miltank, Neptune was also able to get off a few extra Leers because Rollout kept missing, and then knowing that it was going to be the last turn Neptune was on the field, I chose to go for Rage, which ended up critical hitting Miltank, knocking its health down fairly low before Neptune actually ended up falling. So between the decreased defense of Miltank and the critical hit, Miltank was fairly weak by the time I chose to use Enceladus instead of Callisto to finish the battle. I would argue this was the best choice I could have made, because with a pair of acids, Enceladus was able to knock out Miltank. And with that, I was able to open up the region and gain access to a lot of encounters. Before I get to all the catches I made after Whitney, I wanted to make a brief apology. After beating Whitney, I did some research and found out that Staryu only has 1 offensive Psychic type attack. Psychic, which it only learns by TM, which is locked in Kanto. So, knowing that I wouldn't have any Psychic coverage until Kanto, I chose to keep Callisto on the team longer than I meant to, and immediately evolved it into Slowking after gaining access to Fisherman Tully on Route 42. While I waited until at least level 35 to evolve the other 3 stone evolutions on my team, I didn't wait for Slowking. Because Slowpoke has a base 40 special attack, and I didn't want to have to deal with that for the next 3 battles before I got to that level. I did my best to avoid using Callisto, but did end up using her against my rivals Haunter, Morty's Gengar, and Chuck in general. This is probably the most egregious form of cheating I've done so far, and I do promise to try to avoid doing this again in the future. So with that, let's get back to the rest of the video. Once I had access to Olivine, I grabbed the Good Rod and caught Titan the Staryu, who I didn't use until Kanto, Europa the Chinchou, Saturn the Shelder, and then I boxed Neptune. Finally, I grabbed Flash from the Sprout Tower with my new Ice type, and then battled Commodus in the tower. I opened with Saturn against my rival, but chose to swap to Callisto for a reason I'm not entirely sure about. I did want to avoid using Callisto, so I think I only brought her in to make sure I could get Haunter off the field as soon as possible. So I could avoid Sleep and Paralysis, which had plagued me in my Silver run. And once Haunter was off the field, I swapped straight into Neptune. And like I saw in my Gold playthrough, Quagsire is a very effective Pokemon, so even though Mudslap is really weak, just 1 was enough to knock out Magnemite. When my rival's Bayleaf came out, I swapped over to Enceladus, who, I'm gonna say now, I caught purely to deal with this Pokemon. And I again got really lucky with Poison Sting poisoning it on the first hit, and then was able to easily swap over to Acid to finish off Bayleaf. With that, my rival was just down to his Zubat, so once it came to the field, I swapped back into Saturn. And Zubat was able to get off Confuse Ray, but it didn't save him from Saturn's Aurora Beam, which knocked it out with 2 hits. And Saturn didn't end up hitting himself in confusion at any point during the battle. Saturn did really well in the Sprout Tower and in this battle, but he did end up struggling later, so I can't call him the MVP, but even without Skill Link, he was very useful throughout the entirety of this run. I think I made my rival mad by beating him, because as soon as I beat him, the floor gave out from under me, and I plummeted into the basement. And his only response was, "Serves her right," and then leaving me for dead, which at least allowed me to release the beasts. Here's a quick aside, I forgot that Eugene existed, just period, not just in this game and not in Heart Gold Soul Silver. I forget he existed at all, so I didn't capture any footage of him. I've played Heart Gold and Soul Silver more times than I care to admit, and he always blindsides me, just being there. While I can't say that Saturn was the MVP because of how much he struggled during the middle part of this run after getting him, and before I was able to evolve him into Cloyster, I also can't argue that he was the MVP, because Jupiter clearly was. Considering in the first gym battle I had him, he clutched the victory against Bugsy, he also swept a majority of this gym, and was only knocked out because Ghastly used Curse on the first turn. Had that not happened, I'm 90% sure I would have swept the entire gym with him. And while I did end up using Callisto to finish off Gengar and the second Haunter, I'm also pretty sure any other member of my team would have been able to finish off the gym, and this just expedited that. Morty should count himself lucky that he chose Curse, because otherwise his entire gym would have crumbled to an Axolotl with a 10 base power move. With access to Surf, I caught Uranus, the Gyarados, and then promptly never used them. This is also probably the first time I ever actually had a male red Gyarados from the Lake of Rage. I may be entirely wrong and found males in the past 2 games and just didn't think about it, but most of the time when I catch them, they're female. I mean, forgetting to take note of the Gyarados' gender is like how I forgot to turn a Sneasel into Celebi when I played Gold. It's time for a marathon of gym leaders and my rival, but before that, Enceladus and Europa evolved before Chuck, and Ganymede evolved before Jasmine. And I can't believe it's taken me 3 games to mention that Chuck opens by hurling a Strength Rock. But then, when you meet his wife after, she says he's getting a little chubby. If he's able to do that while getting a little chubby, what could he do if he was at Bruno's level of fit? Starting with Chuck, I think he's the only fight that was highly impacted by Callisto evolving early, but he is also still the longest battle of the middle 3 gyms. Not because he's a big threat, but because he landed Hypnosis on Poliwrath after Callisto finished off Primeape in 2 moves. I also chose to play defensively against Poliwrath, going for Disable to prevent Dynamic Punch, which worked out in my favor, but also did leave me vulnerable, so Callisto was put to sleep by Hypnosis for all of maybe 1.5 turns. And Poliwrath didn't put up much of a fight because Surf couldn't do much against my all-water team, and Mind Reader didn't affect Hypnosis, so it was only a matter of time before he fell either to Callisto's Confusion or Europa's Spark. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Price says his middle name is Willow, a wood that bends but doesn't break. I think after how badly his first 2 Pokemon were trounced, he should probably change it to Balsa. His Seal and Piloswine both fell in 1 hit from Spark and Surf respectively, but his Dugong was able to survive the first Spark sent at it when it came to the field. I think if Europa had access to Thunderbolt instead of just Spark, Dugong would have gone down way more easily. I mean, in perspective, it did still go down in 2 hits. Something that none of Jasmine's Pokemon can boast, because Jupiter is the MVP of this run. I said that Chuck was the longest fight of the middle three gyms. Jasmine was the shortest at 34 seconds of video time, or about 1 minute 8 seconds of real life time. In Gold, Silver, and Crystal, Quagsire learns Earthquake at level 35, and 2/3 of Jasmine's team is quad weak to ground. Compounding that, Jupiter got a critical hit Surf, one-shotting her ace Steelix. This sweep isn't even the most impressive thing Jupiter did in this run. With Jasmine, Price, and Chuck out of the way, don't worry, the rest of the battles in this run do take longer than 40 seconds. I will still say that Commodus' greatest threat on his team is his Golbat and Confuse Ray, and Europa was easily able to one-shot it with Spark. You'd think that Meganium being a grass type and it having an incredible advantage against my all-water team would make it a threat, but no. Body Slam did cause problems because it paralyzed on the first turn, so Enceladus had to deal with paralysis for the rest of the battle, and I had to switch from trying to poison Meganium to just using Acid. And at this point, even if Enceladus wasn't able to take down Meganium with Acid because of all the times it was paralyzed, Saturn had Aurora Beam, but Enceladus was still able to clutch the victory against Meganium. The hardest part about Magnemite in the second half of the battle was it being Steel-type. But Jupiter's here, and he was able to fold it like a tortilla. And then, after knocking out Magnemite with a single Earthquake, you can summarize the next bit of this battle by Saturn the Bivalve having a bit of a Napoleon complex trying to prove that he's at least the second best member of the team. And using Surf to clean up the last two Pokemon of the battle, clutching it with 2 HP. I'm gonna be honest here that I've gone on record saying that my challenges aren't meant to be challenging in a difficulty sense, but in a changing your perspective sense. But having said that, I'm disappointed that this run ended up being basically just playing the game normally, and I'm not sure how to make it harder other than not using water types. And even then, if I limited myself to only single-typed Pokemon, I think that that would make this run tedious, not difficult. And if I made it a monotype Nuzlocke, I think that would just make it even more tedious. I do want to revisit this, so sound off in the comments about how you think this could be made more difficult. I also really wish that Claire had a Gyarados from the start instead of just in the remakes. Even with that caveat, she's probably my favorite gym leader in Johto, kind of by default, Jasmine probably being the second. I absolutely messed up in this battle though, because I led with Saturn, and poor guy had to pay for my mistake in blood. Because his physical defense couldn't save him from the special attacking Dragonair. Luckily for me, Callisto was able to easily clean up the first Dragonair, but she was also slower than Dragonair, so the risk of paralysis by Dragon Breath was incredibly high. Luckily for me, the second Dragonair used Thunderbolt instead, but Callisto decided to fall back on the good old Gen 2 leave them with a sliver of health strategy. So unfortunately, she took extra damage leading into the second half, so when the third Dragonair did paralyze her and stop her from attacking, Callisto's fate was sealed, so I swapped over to Ganymede, who hasn't really made an impact in the major battles, but was really useful in all the other battles of the game. Once she was on the field, I chose not to waste the power points of any of my physical moves and just used Surf to finish off Dragonair, who was already at like 5 health. I have to admit that as little as she's actually done for the video itself, I am a little giddy that Ganymede was able to do so much in this battle. Because she basically ignored the smoke screen that Kingdra laid down, then used her physical moves to knock its health incredibly low, forcing Claire to heal. And then, not letting up from the assault, got a critical hit on Kingdra, taking half of its health on the turn it healed. Then, Ganymede tanked a critical hit Hyper Beam that left her with 2 health, and responded by knocking Kingdra out, defeating Claire. Unfortunately, where there is light, there is also darkness. Because, oh boy, did I mess up immediately after battling Claire. Because while I didn't fail the Dragon's Den quest, because I can't, but apparently Claire can, I underestimated Europa and ended up knocking out Suicune before I could catch it. And I failed to save before battling Suicune, and my last save was before Claire. And save states in the Gen 2 games are weirdly glitchy, like, if I had a Pokemon in my party when I set the save state, and then it was in the PC when I reloaded, that Pokemon would disappear glitchy. And after having to replay most of Blue because of a save state error, I was reluctant to use them. If it is any consolation, however, I probably wouldn't have used Suicune because I really believed in the team that I had. With that in mind, as soon as I reached the League, I used a Water Stone to evolve Saturn into Cloyster. Before battling the Elite Four though, let's cover the final battle I had with Commodus before the League, before Saturn evolved. Commodus opened up with his Sneasel, and I opened with Ganymede, who was able to one-shot her opponent with Submission. A fairly straightforward and easy opening to a battle that ended up not being as easy as you'd think. Saturn sent in his Golbat second, and as you know, he always opens with Confuse Ray, so when I swapped into Saturn, he was immediately confused. And Dark moves are special prior to Generation 4, bypassing Saturn's high physical defense, so while he hit himself in confusion, he also took a lot of damage from Bite. Meaning that even though he did get off a single Surf attack, it wasn't enough and he fell. When he did, I followed up with Europa, who was, luckily enough, faster than Golbat, meaning she could outspeed and one-shot it with her Spark attack. Unfortunately for me, Meganium came out third, so I swapped over to Enceladus. My first Acid attack with Enceladus didn't do nearly enough damage to Meganium, and it was able to set up Reflect, meaning my Poison-type attacks did less after. Meganium was then also able to add on to that by paralyzing Enceladus with Body Slam. One of the Body Slams from Meganium also was a critical hit, bringing Enceladus' health incredibly low, which guaranteed that if Enceladus was paralyzed for even a single turn, he would go down before Meganium would. And while for a time luck seemed to be on my side, Enceladus was fully paralyzed the turn before it could fully knock out Meganium. So, while Meganium was left with red health, Enceladus went down, so I swapped over to Ganymede, who was able to easily clean up Meganium with a Body Slam of her own. And luckily, the worst of the fight is behind us because when Kadabra came in, I sent in Jupiter, who with a single Earthquake was able to knock out the Psychic Pokemon, although it was able to set up a Future Sight. And because my rival still had 2 more Pokemon in reserve, I knew that I was going to take that Future Sight attack at some point. Luckily for me though, my rival decided to follow up Kadabra with Haunter, so I swapped over to Callisto, who took Future Sight on Switch-In. Thanks to that, I was guaranteed to be able to win the rest of the battle, even if Callisto fell to Haunter. But rather than attack, Haunter chose to set up Curse, which would never come into effect because as soon as it went down, Callisto swapped out. And I love the Magnemite line, but Commodus really saved the worst for last. Because so long as I have Jupiter, it's not going to be able to do anything. A single Earthquake was enough to crush the Magnet. And after this, as you already know, I leveled up Saturn to the point that it learned Ice Beam and then evolved it before taking on the Elite Four. Starting the league off against Will, Europa was easily able to make short work of Xatu with a single Spark. Which leads me to ask, who would win in a fight? Price's Dugong or Will's Xatu? Or maybe to make it fair, Lorelei's Dugong and Will's Xatu? Past that, Will brought in Executor next, so I swapped to Enceladus for some reason, instead of, I don't know, one of my Pokemon with ice coverage. It's not even like I swapped over to him to, get a clean switch. I was definitely planning on trying to poison Executor because I used Poison Sting. But the saddest part about this is Enceladus won with a critical hit Acid knocking out Executor. Then, what's even sadder is he also knocked out Will's Jinx. I know that he's partially named after a giant who took the combined forces of Heracles and Athena to take down, but seeing him put in his all to knock out 2 of the Psychic Specialists' team, I was so moved that when Slowbro came out, I just swapped straight over to Callisto. Also so that I could have an honor battle, sort of, between Slowking and Slowbro. I made a joke that trainers in Johto are so weak that there's no honor in defeating them. There's also no honor in this battle considering Callisto has 9 levels on her adversary. So even taking that attack on Switch-In really didn't change the outcome of this battle. Although the battle did last a lot longer than you'd probably expect just hearing that, but remember, the only neutral damage that can be done is Slowbro's Body Slam because all of Callisto's moves are resisted. And even still, Callisto did more damage with Psychic, which led Will to bringing out his ace Xatu, but it couldn't stay on the field very long. So, with one last Ice Punch, super effective one-shot knockout, I beat Will's Psychic team and moved on to Koga's Poison. So Ariados might as well not have existed because unlike the other members of Koga's team, he wasn't fast enough to even do anything on the one turn he was on the field. So I'll just take this brief bit of time to say the only threats Koga had for me are Fortress because I don't have any fire coverage, and his Muck because I don't have anything that can hit through evasion. But Fortress ended up not really being that much of a threat because even though he did survive on a sliver of health, why does that happen so often in Johto games? It's a genuine question. He only set up spikes that didn't matter because Callisto never switched out. Then Venomoth was able to set up Toxic, which was probably the most beneficial thing anything on Koga's team did for him. Because all Crobat did was set up Double Team before also being knocked out in one hit from Callisto's Psychic. If it wasn't for Muck being so lucky with Minimize, I'd say this was probably the easiest time I've had in the Johto Elite Four so far in this series. And even with all of that luck from Minimize, I can still count on one hand the number of times Callisto took damage, and 3 of those times were from Toxic. The third of those 4 times was from Muck's Sludge Bomb, but it didn't do as much damage as Toxic ended up doing anyway. And then on the next turn, Psychic was able to make contact, which one-shot Muck. And with that, I moved on to my match against Bruno's fighting team. I chose to use Ganymede against Bruno because I didn't want to waste any more of Callisto's Psychics than I already had, and while I crashed into Detect on the first turn, the second Waterfall made contact, but didn't flinch, because it lacked a secondary effect until Generation 4, so I was wasting a move slot on it instead of just using Surf. What's worse is I tried to take advantage of Dig by setting up Rain Dance, but it lasted until the next turn, so I had to waste another turn to set up Rain again. Because when Lance sets up Rain Dance, it lasts long enough to land 3 Thunders in a row, but when I do it, it doesn't even last as long as Sleep. At least I took down Hitmontop fairly easily, and even though Hitmonchan does learn Thunder Punch, it's still special, so it did single-digit damage before I knocked it out with Waterfall. And then, of course, as soon as Hitmonlee comes out, my rain dissipates. So for the remainder of the battle with it, I have to deal with slightly less powerful Waterfalls, while it was able to hit its first high jump kick. But after I left it with a sliver of health, it missed the second and knocked itself out. Finally, for Ganymede came out Machamp, who after taking her to 3 health with a cross chop, wasn't knocked out the next turn, and knocked her out, so I brought in Europa. Bruno took advantage of the swap by healing his Machamp up to full health, but a single Surf was enough to drain half of Machamp's health, so in 2 turns it was knocked out, forcing Bruno to bring out his last Pokemon, Onix, who fell to a single Surf, obviously. Aside from not using Callisto and Hitmontop's Dig shenanigans, this battle was still fairly easy, fairly straightforward, so let's finally move on to Karen. As always, Karen led with her Umbreon, the bane of my existence, and of course it used Confuse Ray turn 1. At least this time, it had the courtesy of not using Sand Attack turn 2. Because I was already running Submission, which only has 80% accuracy, and you know, if it's not 100%, it's 50%. You know the phrase at this point. But Submission did land, but it left Umbreon with a sliver of health, so poor Ganymede took a lot of recoil, but then her next Body Slam knocked it out, so even Stevens. And without 90% of her power in Umbreon, the rest of her team was kind of a joke, and she just immediately fell apart. I know I should have been afraid of Vileplume, because it's Grass type, but I have Callisto and Jupiter. So I brought in Callisto, who dodged Stun Spore and only took 55 damage from Petal Dance, to one-shot Vileplume. Then, out came her Murkrow, who was one-shot by Callisto's Ice Punch because 4/5 of Karen's team is weak to at least one move on Callisto. Gengar was, of course, able to paralyze with its first lick and then got a critical hit on the second, but Callisto survived and knocked it out with a single Psychic. Then Karen brought out her only Pokemon left, Houndoom, who was actually able to defeat Callisto because she was paralyzed and in red health. So, while she can claim that she did something that 8 other Pokemon for the Elite Four couldn't, it really doesn't count, and I still had Jupiter in my back pocket, and I brought out Ganymede. I mean, okay, Ganymede wasn't able to secure the win with her first move, but it did mean that Houndoom was forced to heal, wasting a turn, so when my next Waterfall made contact, and my final Body Slam got an unnecessary critical hit, Houndoom fainted and Ganymede gained a level, and I chose not to learn Mind Reader because I'm not running Dynamic Punch. Also, I was allowed to finally take on Lance and finish the Johto half of this challenge. I'm sorry, for some reason my video file seems to be pulsating, and I'm not really sure how to fix that, so just kinda roll with it. Anyway, the only Pokemon on Lance's team that I would classify as a threat is his Thundering Dragonite, which Gyarados can bolster by setting up Rain. And luckily for me, Europa was able to one-shot it with Spark before it could do that. From Gold and Silver, I assumed that Lance would send out his Thundering Dragonite second, so I swapped over to Jupiter, who ended up absorbing a Thunder Wave on switch-in, followed by him tanking a Hyper Beam before being able to put down the first illegal Dragonite with 2 Ice Punches. While I believe that given the chance, Jupiter could have probably swept Lance's whole team, I swapped over to Callisto against the second Dragonite. This did lead to her being paralyzed, but she was already slower than Dragonite, and since she moved through paralysis anyway, her high special attack meant that 1 Ice Punch was enough to put down the second Dragonite, and Lance responded by sending in his Ace. But him pulling out the big guns so early did nothing for him when I swapped over to Saturn. I mean, Saturn did have to take a special attack Outrage, which did a lot of damage, because of course I swapped Saturn in on a special move. But even with no investment in his speed stat, he still outsped Lance's Ace Dragonite and one-shot it with Ice Beam, leaving Lance with only his Aerodactyl and Charizard, meaning the rest of this battle is just a formality. And knowing that it didn't matter who I went into against Aerodactyl or Charizard, I chose to send in Enceladus against Aerodactyl. So on switch-in, Enceladus took the Rock Slide from Aerodactyl, but responded with a Surf that one-shot the fossil Pokemon. So each of us only having 1 Pokemon left, Lance, Total, and me, to use before I've used all 6, I swapped over to Ganymede against his final Charizard. Ganymede's first Waterfall brought Charizard to red health, but instead of healing on the next turn, I think Lance was trying to go for another wing attack, so Ganymede still outsped Charizard, knocking it out with her second Waterfall. With that, I've beaten the Johto half of this challenge and opened the doorway to getting my final team member. Once I was in Kanto, the first thing I did was retrieve the Psychic TM in Saffron. Then I boxed Callisto and exchanged them for Titan the Staryu, who I evolved into Starmie and taught Psychic. To start my final battle with Commodus, I'll take a second to remind you of the names of my rivals in Generation 2. Luke, Octavian, and Commodus. And then immediately get into the battle by saying that Ganymede was easily able to one-shot Sneasel with submission. Again. And like the battle I had with him in Victory Road, Commodus followed that up with his Golbat, and I brought out newcomer Titan. And, as has happened many times before, Titan was confused on switch-in. That confusion ultimately didn't matter because Titan hit through it and one-shot Golbat with Psychic. And then my rival brought out his Magneton, who, as always, I met with Jupiter, who, with a single Earthquake, was able to knock out his opponent. For the first half of this battle, I am 3 for 3s when it comes to Okos. Unfortunately, I do not keep that pattern up into the second half, thanks to my rival's Meganium coming out 4th. Because I remembered the last battle where Acid didn't do nearly enough from Enceladus, so I tried to poison Meganium instead. Not even with Toxic, which I did have the TM for because I had already beaten Janine, I just never used the Toxic TM for some reason. And while it may have been a misplay, it actually was the correct decision to go for the weaker move over and over because I was able to wear down the light screen that Meganium settled. So when Meganium went down and Kadabra came out, I swapped over to Europa and the light screen faded on switch-in, which meant the spark she then let off was full power, but it was unfortunately not enough to one-shot Alakazam. Luckily, Europa was beefy enough to survive the 2 Psychics from Alakazam, and then retaliate with a critical hit spark to finish it off. I like that I am simultaneously getting a bunch of unnecessary critical hits throughout this run, and also getting completely necessary critical hits. Finally, out came Gengar, and I responded with Saturn, because ghosts are physical this generation, and I was able to take advantage of that using Saturn's beefy defense stat. Because on Switch In, he was able to absorb a Shadow Ball, and then the next turn outspeed Gengar to one-shot it with Ice Beam. Now comes the part of our story that gets a little bit sad. Like I said, where there's light, there's darkness, and I've been breezing through this run until this point. Like with Silver, I chose to go in under-leveled against my first match with Red because being at his level in Gold was way too easy. I failed to take into account that in Silver, I had a team that was pretty well balanced between physical and special attackers. And while I did have Earthquake, Submission, and Acid, aside from Earthquake, they all had their own drawbacks. And I failed to give Enceladus Toxic before this battle, and I didn't even do it in the rematch. But also take into account that Snorlax has Rest, so even if I Toxic poisoned it, it could just sleep to get rid of the condition. And Red Snorlax has Stab Snore, which can flinch, so if I'm slower than it and it's asleep, it'll make Whitney's Miltank look like a joke. So with all that in mind, you can understand why I was hyping it up in Silver and Gold. Because its third move is Amnesia, which boosts special defense. So even though I was able to breeze through most of the battle with Red, when Snorlax came out and was able to boost its own special defense, and then take advantage of my weakened party to remove all of my physical attackers, I hit a point where I was guaranteed to wipe the battle, and that's just what happened. But I didn't want to leave the Johto games on a loss, so I decided to rematch Red, but I only leveled up some of my Pokemon. So let's just move straight on to my winning match. Remember how I said that Jupiter's most impressive sweep was later? This is later. For the rest of the time that Jupiter is on the field, remember that the one thing Pikachu did before being knocked out by Earthquake was use Charm, which lowered his attack by 2 stages. Following Pikachu was Venusaur, and, being wary of unnecessary damage, I chose not to switch out Jupiter. Keeping in mind the attack debuff Jupiter had, I chose to use Ice Punch against Venusaur, and because it went for Solar Beam over Giga Drain, the attack went through, and Venusaur was frozen. Since Venusaur was frozen, I chose to clean it up with Earthquake, and luckily it was frozen for 2 turns, meaning it did no damage, and I knocked it out. And third out was Espeon, who set up Reflect. However, it didn't save him, because even with the attack debuff and Reflect, Earthquake was enough to OHKO it. At this point in the battle, I realized 2 things. Number 1, I wasn't going to be able to use all 6 of my Pokemon unless things went really poorly, and 2, Jupiter was not going to make it past Snorlax. Even though Snorlax also set up Amnesia, I chose to go for Ice Punch because I at least wanted to try to freeze it in case I could wait out the Reflect and do more damage. Unfortunately, this didn't work, and eventually Jupiter went down and I swapped straight into Ganymede. The timing couldn't have been better though, because as soon as Ganymede hit the field, Reflect faded, but she did miss her first submission, and was paralyzed by Body Slam, so she ended up taking a lot of damage before she could actually attack Snorlax. With only 39 health left, she made contact with Submission, one-shotting what was left of Snorlax's health, but also taking herself down in the process. With the field now empty, Red brought out his Blastoise, and I brought in Titan. I decided to try and swap around a little bit against Blastoise, so after Titan used Psychic and almost took half of Blastoise's health, I saw that Blastoise had Whirlpool, and not wanting to be stuck in an inopportune position if I swapped into someone weak, I chose to go straight over to Europa. And with a single Spark, Europa was able to take down Blastoise, forcing Red down to his last Pokemon, Charizard. I made the judgment call that because the battle had already gone on far too long and I had already used all 6 Pokemon against Red in the previous battle, that I was just going to let Europa take down Charizard with a single Surf. And with that, I finished my run of Pokemon Crystal with only Water-type Pokemon. I'm going to sum up this run and challenge by saying there's a lot of potential here for a very difficult or fun challenge. However, it also runs the risk of becoming very tedious if you decide to add on a bunch of extraneous rules. Water is a very good type to experiment with a challenge like this because of how plentiful the type is. but it also means that it will become boring if you end up using a bunch of dual-type Pokemon like I did. I would be open to trying this challenge again in the future with a different type. Especially because I'm not really proud of how I did in this run. Not because my Pokemon were particularly bad, but because I changed my plans so often that it caused problems. For one, I did plan to catch Suicune and use it on the team for a while, and then replace it with Neptune for the battle against Red, but when I failed to catch Suicune, I decided to just stick with the team I had, plus Titan. As I said previously, I do regret evolving Callisto as early as I did. I'm adding Crystal to the tentative list of games I want to revisit with different challenges, which so far is just Pokemon Crystal and probably all of Generation 3 and 4. For now though, it is time to move on to Generation 3, and I'm going to start out with a hardcore Nuzlocke of Pokemon Ruby. I'm also going to open up a thread on my community page to see what games other than Pokemon you all would like me to play. There's also going to be a second thread where I'm going to outline some of the tentative ideas for Generation 3 challenges I created when I started my channel that is incredibly open to change. If you'd like to help me brainstorm ways to improve those challenges, suggest alternatives, or just get a preview of what's coming for me in the future, stop by, and whether I see you there, in the comments here, or in my next upload, whatever it may be, remember to love yourselves. See ya!